Hey everyone, this is Mason Hutchison, and you're listening to HerbRally, your daily herbal podcast. We come out with new episodes about 5 days a week, so be sure to tune in often. Our goal for the show is to help you along your herbalist journey, no matter what stage you're at. We have over 678 episodes, so feel free to peruse those episodes, and you're bound to find something of interest. Today's episode is yet another edition of the Herbalist Hour, and this time I'm joined by guest KP Khalsa. So I took KP Khalsa's, or one of his classes, a long time ago, many years ago at Lane Community College in Eugene, Oregon. A lot of times I'll say, the Columbine School of Botanical Studies was my first herbal apprenticeship, but really, the first actual herbal class I took was one with KP Khalsa. I think I was in my early 20s at that point, but I'm from Eugene, and KP lives in Eugene, and so it was great to have such a experienced herbalist around. And it was nice to get to know him a bit more in this conversation. We chat about calamus, dandelion, triphala, and all sorts of topics. So it was a lot of fun. We actually got to hang out in person for this interview as opposed to, say, Zoom. Thanks to Mountain Rose Herbs for letting us borrow their annex space, which is right next to their Mountain Rose Herbs Mercantile. And thanks to KP Khalsa for joining me on the Herbalist Hour. You can learn more about him and his work at internationalintegrative.com, and as per usual, I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. So although this episode was done in person, if you'd like to join us live for our Zoom interviews for the Herbalist Hour, our HerbRally Schoolhouse members can actually join us live and interact and ask questions and whatnot. If you'd like to learn more about that, you could go to herbrally.com/schoolhouse. And not only can you join us live for the Herbalist Hours, there's also other membership perks such as exclusive classes, herbal community discounts, and a lot more. So again, learn more at herbrally.com/schoolhouse. And if you'd like to try your first 30 days for free, you could use coupon code podcast at checkout. And then it's only $10 a month after that. So a huge thank you to all of our members. Your support really means a lot to us. I think that's going to do it for me today. Thanks so much for listening to the Herbalist Hour on the HerbRally podcast, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care.
Welcome to the Herbalist Hour. This is where community gather, merging the power of people and the flowers, the sweet and the bitter to the salty, the sour. Umami, it's time for the Herbalist Hour.
Welcome back to the Herbalist Hour. Today I'm joined by KP Khalsa. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Mason. Good to be here.
So I don't know if you recall or not, but back, I want to say in 2007, 2008, you were actually the very first herb class that I took.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. So this was at Lane Community College.
Right.
And you were doing, I want to say it was like an intro to Ayurveda, perhaps even TCM, and maybe even Western herbalism. But I remember, I want to say once every Thursday or so, we'd get together for, I think it was like 3 hours long each class. And it was just always, I always really appreciated, you were like this rapid fire teacher, but you were still easy to digest the information, but then you would constantly throw in, say, like a ton of just dry humor, which always made like the learning more palatable. So I just want to say thank you for that. You really got my herbalist journey going in that regard. But I've always been curious. I've never actually asked you, how did you get into herbalism?
Yeah, well, this goes back a long time. I've been in the field for 51 years. So I was an older teenager, and it was during the hippie times. I was interested, like everybody else, in anything that was new and different and, exciting. And so all this was part of it. I began to run into some people who knew something about herbs and experimented with them a little bit, and then it just really grabbed me, and I just kept doing it. There was no way to formally learn at that time, anyway. No schools, no books, nothing. So you had to just learn wherever you could pick it up. And there ended up being about a dozen of us in the United States that were serious enough about it that we could teach each other. So when we would go through each other's towns, I'll show you mine, you show me yours, and gradually that built up over time. Yeah.
Who were some of like the early teachers you remember hanging out with? Was this at like conferences and stuff like that, like say Brighton Bush or whatever?
Yeah, Brighton Bush got going sometime shortly after that. I've been to Brighton Bush in more recent times, but I wasn't there initially. The American Herbalist Guild, of which I was the president a while ago, was founded there in the hot springs of Brighton Bush.
Wow.
Well, many of my teachers, not necessarily the people in my cohort, but our actual teachers were people like naturopathic physicians and chiropractors who are a generation older and had studied, in the 30s, something like that, when natural healing was still at least somewhat available and formal, and they were able to go to some schools for those kinds of skills and then helped teach us. So Dr. Christopher, Dr. Jensen, there were a number of others who probably would be less well known. Dr. Bastyr was an early mentor. He's, of course, it has a school named for him in Seattle. Yeah.
Yeah, we were hanging out with Paul Bergner a couple weeks ago, and he was saying how Dr. Bastyr, the school was named after him. He basically was like, if you memorize one herb every day for 40 years, they're going to end up naming a university after you. So he sounds like, did you meet Dr. Bastyr?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. So it was funny, I was looking up your bio earlier today, and I want to say in 2017, it said you've been an herbalist for 47 years at that point. And I was like, holy shit, like you've been doing it for well over 50 years at this point.
That's right.
That's incredible. I'm curious, do you have any clue how many students you've had over the past 50 years?
Oh, it's been thousands, I'm sure. I haven't kept count. But, in earlier times, before things got as formalized as they are now, I was doing a lot of the kinds of classes like you talked about, where it would be, a 3-hour class every Wednesday for 4 Wednesdays, something like that, at many, many different venues. I lived in Seattle for 30 years, and so there are, numerous community colleges and other venues there, and so it was just night after night after night for decades doing that kind of thing. So that bumps up the student number,
Sure.
These days,
there's online.
But,
online too now.
Of course, yeah. These days I'm focusing more on professional level, and of course there are fewer folks in those classes, but we dive deeper.
Sure. So you lived in Seattle. You're originally from Eugene, though, yeah?
Well, I'm from Oregon, actually. I
Oregon.
went to college in Eugene, and then I left to travel on to a few other things, and then ended up in Seattle for 30 years.
Okay, so Yogi Tea, famous tea company from Eugene, Oregon. I know that you've been involved with them, but I'm curious, when did you jump in, like say, working with them or consulting for them, or did you like help start that company? What's your history with them?
I didn't start the company, but I was involved fairly early.
Yeah.
And that was very much kind of a bootstrap company, and they started with some chopped up herbs in a little bag with a staple on the shelves of a health food store. So sometime after that, I knew all the people who were involved, and we gradually started talking, and they would connect with me about formulating and those kinds of ideas. And so I was sort of in and out, but not formally for a long time. Then I actually formally began to be the senior research scientist, is what they called it. But it was basically the medicinal formulator for, I guess it was about 20 years, something like that. Yeah, until about, now it's been quite some time that I haven't been with them. It's been about 12 years, I think, yeah.
Actually, this is a good time to say thanks to Mountain Rose Herbs. They're letting us use their annex building right next to their store. Mountain Rose Herbs, another famous local herb company. Yeah. I suppose you didn't did you ever do any consulting or work with Mountain Rose Herbs in any way?
No, never. I'm waiting for the invitation. We'll see what happens.
Another fond KP memory for me was getting to hang out with you a bit at the Rootstock Festival, which was hosted by Mountain Rose Herbs all those years ago.
That's right.
Do you have any memories of that event or fun things you want to share?
Well, that was a really nice environment because it was an outdoor kind of venue with outdoor stages and things, and the audience was especially knowledgeable. So I taught a class there, and people were very responsive. It was a nice place to be just in that environment. It was nice weather, which of course is nice for the Northwest.
Sure.
So that was good. Yeah, that was a fun time.
Such a good time. Yeah, I like to credit Rootstock with essentially making my career there. I wasn't in the marketing department or doing the events at the time, and then that opportunity to work on the event happened, and then I worked, I want to say 70 hours in say like a week period of time on that event, and then the rest is kind of history. They threw them into the events and everything. So yeah, that was a life-changing event for me. That was Rootstock back in 2011, I want to say. Actually, so I was telling you before we started the interview that we have a surprise video question for you. So I'm going to play that for you now.
Okay, video question.
And we'll just splice it into the here we go.
Hey KP, it's Rosalee, your favorite herb student. Just kidding. I studied with you, KP, for years, both in class and through a mentorship. And I learned so many things from you that I think about every day. In fact, I can still hear your voice in my head at times. And one thing that really stuck with me over the years is how incredibly important dosage is. I think that's something that can be overly, just like looked over or overly simplified. And I think that learning that from you and really dialing that in, and how there's no one dosage for anybody, but learning all of that, I think is what made me get such great results when working with people and plants, because that can be a huge missing factor for folks. So wondering if you would speak to that, the importance of dosage, and perhaps maybe why there's some confusion about dosage between different traditional methods and different modalities. Thanks, KP.
Yeah, hi, Rosalee. Well, as soon as I saw Rosalee's face in the video question, I knew the question was going to be about dose. I seem to be the dose guy in the herb world now for whatever reason. I'm involved to about equal degree in Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, and Western herbalism. And all those big three systems have different kinds of approaches to dose, with, of course, Chinese medicine typically the doses being the highest, and Ayurveda following closely thereafter, and then Western herbs generally being minuscule by comparison. So if we look at the kinds of doses that have been used in the past in Western herbalism, we have to go back, a century or more probably to see when it was stable and well functioning. And then we look at TCM and Ayurveda kinds of doses. We see that generally people were using doses much, much higher than, for whatever reason, they kind of wound down to today. So when herbal medicine got rejuvenated in North America starting around about 1970, and I was part of that, initial revolution, the kinds of doses that we were seeing people using were just minute amounts of herbs, and then we'd look at maybe even the same herb and how it was used in another system, and sometimes they were using amounts 15, 20, 30, 50 times, literally the amounts that North American herbalists were using. Even if we looked at Europe and looked at tincture doses, they often were using doses that were 7 to 10 times higher than those. So my general sense is that somehow people lost confidence in herbal medicine, or we had about 3 generations of people from about 1910 to about 1970 who had no exposure to herbal medicine at all in any kind of a formal way. Of course, there was grandma herbalism, which has always continued, but when the natural healing system crashed in North America, people just didn't have the chance to experiment with these kinds of things. And I think when it came back, people were very hesitant. They were more concerned about how they could be hurt by these things than how they could be benefited. And this idea of these minuscule doses, developed. And I just discovered, along with many other people in my cohort, that as we began to experiment with getting good results, and we just thought, well, maybe if we used a little more, it'd be a little better. And it was, and then a little more and a little more. And most of us found the same thing, really, that if we'd been in practice for 10 years or so, we'd realized that we had to use doses that were not in the herb books yet. So, right, Rosalee, you were right about the requirement to use appropriate doses, and of course that's going to be different for everybody, but generally speaking, we need to use higher doses for most people, and we discovered that really makes a big difference. Now, of course, that means more yucky, bad-tasting tea, or more pills to swallow, or a bunch of more expensive tincture, or whatever it is. So, we have to talk to the individual and find out what's likely to work really well.
There you go, Rosalee. Nice. Kind of transitioning, I kind of want to plug some of your projects. You wrote a book called The Way of Ayurvedic Herbs. I want to say you co-authored that with Michael Tierra. In fact, when I was looking at your bio, it appears over the past 50 years you were involved with 30 plus books of some sort, whether that was editing capacity or writing them. Right. I'm just kind of curious the story behind you co-authoring a book with Michael Tierra, and like maybe a little bit more about the book in general.
It was really pretty straightforward. Michael and I traveled in the same circles when we were, younger adults. We were hippies, and it turned out that we knew a bunch of the same people. We didn't meet really then. It was a few years later that we met, but we had a lot of mutual friends, and so I knew his name very early. He lived in a hippie commune in the mountains in Northern California, and I lived in, yoga ashrams, and we were both very interested in what herbalism was all about. And then we connected when the American Herbalist Guild, which he founded, got going. And I rapidly became an officer in that. I was an officer for about 20 years, eventually had become the president. And so I met him there, we became friends. And then he'd written a book, Planetary Herbology, or actually first he wrote The Way of Herbs, right? So that's where that started. And that was long ago, in the early 70s. That had been around for a long time. Then a few years later he wrote the way of Chinese herbs, and I thought, well, gosh, there's one more missing, and that's the Ayurvedic herb. And I just approached him and said, can we finish the trilogy together? And we did. So that was a great experience cranking that out.
It appears there's an overlap between hippie culture and herbalist.
You think?
I like to joke that I'm a recovering hippie. I'm still, according to everybody else that knows me, I'm still a hippie.
Okay,
but,
there you go. Yeah. Well, I'll raise my hand for membership in that too. I don't look quite as much like a hippie anymore, but you'll notice. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, do you still practice Kundalini yoga or teach it or anything like that?
Yeah, I do. I don't have much chance to teach it just because I'm doing various other things, but my personal practice involves that. Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of tell us what Kundalini yoga is and maybe how it differs than, say, like some traditional forms of yoga?
Oh yeah, it's one branch on the trunk of yoga, and generally speaking, it's designed for people who are householders to practice, and so the practices are efficient, relatively short, do a lot in a short time. There's often a lot of movement in the yoga practices, and so it's convenient for people that have a life like you and I do, families and mortgages and cars and things like that. We're not living in a cave.
Yeah, I want to say I got a VHS tape of Kundalini yoga from the Eugene Public Library one time. Maybe I'm misremembering, but I do remember it being quite vigorous, at least this particular teacher. And I remember doing like circles, and I don't remember what that was particularly called, but I remember eventually it got incredibly tiring.
Sure.
So can you kind of maybe speak to some of the health benefits from Kundalini yoga?
Well, yeah, I mean, yoga is yoga, really,
Yeah.
and these are all just kind of, facets of the gem.
Yeah.
But most of them involve, some kind of a physical culture kind of thing,
Yeah.
muscular development, that sort of thing, and then, of course, breathing. But the yoga and Ayurveda as a system is a complete healing system for people just about in any kind of condition, householders or celibate meditators and everybody in between. So there's all kinds of teachings about diet, herbal medicine, sleep, the way you live their life. It's a huge, huge system. So all the ways that people approach yoga are just a bit different depending on their particular experience, what they'd like to get out of it, how long they have to practice, that sort of thing.
What other health practices do you implement in your life, say from your Sikh religion?
Sikh religion doesn't really have health practices per se. I mean, it's like Catholicism or any
Sure.
other religion. Sikhism would encourage you to do things as appropriate to remain healthy, but there are no specific recommendations.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess I had a misconception because I feel like I've read a book. I can't remember who wrote it. Probably Dr. Is it Bajni or I want to say someone. I read some book on Sikhism and health, and I want to say they were very emphatic on the sleep aspect and the movement and all that. But it's funny because I don't really get that from other religions per se. But maybe I'm just kind of I don't know, confusing the two. But
well, Sikhism is very congenial toward health practices,
Yeah.
but there's no specific kinds of things recommended. It's a lifestyle. I mean, we don't even call it a religion.
Yeah.
We call it a lifestyle, or you could say a philosophy, because it includes just ways of being in the world.
Yeah.
And herbal medicine or dietary things aren't really part of that necessarily, but it would just be we would be encouraged to take care of ourselves.
Makes sense. Can you speak to the International Integrative Education Institute?
Wow.
Did I get it?
You got it all out. Or as we like to say, I. Yeah, so that's my school, and we teach a wide variety of courses there. We have a faculty. I'm the main teacher of most of the courses, but our flagship courses are professional trainings in herbalism, Ayurveda, and nutrition. So people can get certificates as a therapist in any one of those areas. Our herb program has been going the longest and is the longest. It's a 3-year program, and it's largely designed around the factors of the American Herbalist Guild, so that's the only organization that offers a nationwide certification for practicing clinical herbalists. And so we're not officially affiliated with that group, but the curriculum is designed around their requirements. So then people do get a credential from that organization, registered herbalist, which is the one that I carry. I was one of the first registered herbalists to get that credential. And then there are other professional associations having to do with things like nutritional therapy and Ayurveda. And so people then can apply using the material they learn from us to get those credentials.
So I got KP with me. I want to ask you about some, say, herbs now, like maybe some Ayurvedic herbs and maybe some Western herbs, but can you teach us about, say, Triphala?
Oh yeah, Triphala is a combination of 3 fruits. They're kind of little wrinkly fig-like fruits that grow in the foothills of the Himalayas. Tri means 3, phal is fruit, so 3 fruits combination. Those the names of those are Amla, Haritaki, and Bibitaki. And that's the most consumed herbal formula in the entire world. You have probably 4 billion people taking that on a daily basis, something like that, because the Ayurveda world, of course, includes India, which of course is, large population, and then a bunch of countries around there, plus other people, in other places. And so it's used for literally everything in Ayurveda. It's the most consumed, the most useful. So in terms of the energetics of the body, Triphala helps to balance all those various energetics. So it's not too hot, not too cold, not too heavy, not too light, etc. Those 3 things work together as the ultimate, very mild, slow-acting, tonifying remedy. So it's not only is it tonifying, but it's also detoxifying. So it's about half and half building and reducing in the body, and so people can take that forever. So it's pretty much assumed that if you're involved with Ayurveda, you're going to be taking a gram or 2 of those dried fruits ground and mixed together in powder, maybe capsules, whatever way you want to take it, and you can take it for a lifetime. Now we do use it for a few acute kinds of things. So one of the herbs in there, Haritaki, is a little laxative. So most people think about Triphala on kind of a folk level as being a mild, comfortable laxative that people can take. But really it's the base of virtually every Ayurvedic formula. It's in 95% of traditional Ayurvedic formulas. So it doesn't do a whole lot very fast, that's the thing. So I usually don't use a lot of Triphala initially because people come to me, they have specific problems that they want to have addressed, and Triphala kind of addresses everything but in a mild, slow way. So I usually add the Triphala in after we've made quite a bit of progress and we're heading toward more of a maintenance program.
Do you take it?
I do.
So you were talking about how you could take it, and the only way I've ever taken it myself has been mixing the powder in like water and then chugging it.
Yeah, did you like that?
I think Mountain Rose actually has a funny video of their staff tasting it, but yeah, it is quite intense. But how do you take it personally?
Just in powder form, in some way.
Okay.
And I'm very used to stirring things into liquids. And
Sure.
cooking them
Yeah.
down. Triphala has all the 6 Ayurvedic tastes. So it's astringent, bitter, a little bit pungent, and so all those kind of gaggy tastes are, are right there. But I've been doing this for so long that my taste has evolved, and it's okay with me.
It's one of the side perks of being an herbalist is your palate becomes a lot more accepting of random flavors.
Without a doubt. Well, I'm constantly accused of saying that something, has a really neutral taste, like ashwagandha, for example. To me, it kind of tastes like sawdust, and you could get it in your mouth any way you want, swallow it down, stir it into your oatmeal, whatever. But then I tell that to a client or a student, and the client back can say, what kind of sawdust have you been tasting? That's the worst thing I've ever tasted. So yeah, our palates do expand.
So you were saying that it's okay to consume in a capsule, and I know a lot of times a lot of herbal medicine comes from the taste, actually tasting the herb, but you're saying perhaps the compliance aspect, it outweighs the actually tasting the Triphala in this case.
That's it. Compliance is the number one thing in general. Of course, if you don't take it, it's not going to work. And so we have problems with that in our culture today, just because herbal medicine is becoming much more well known to people out there in the general public, and you have Mr. and Mrs. every person wanting to use these things, but they have no background. My practice for 40 years was aging hippies in my same age cohort, and we'd all read all the same books back in the 60s and 70s and tried, we ate tofu and really exotic things like that. And so people knew kind of these basic ideas, and they were a little more adventurous. Now though, you have people that are looking to take their first herbal medicine at 70 years old, and all they'd taken before was drugs, and everything is foreign, and they do have difficulty with compliance with either just the amount you have to take. It's not one erythromycin 3 times a day. It's a handful of whatever it is, pills or whatever. So yes, it would be better to taste things, and I would prefer to do that personally, and I would like it if people would do it, but it's just overwhelming for people.
Sure.
Most herbs taste bad. and so it's just a matter of chucking it down. So I think that better to do it than not do it, so fine to take it as a pill.
How many herbs would you say you've kind of become a master on, like as far as like educated on?
Well, I have a repertoire of about 2,000 herbs, which is pretty typical for people who have been in it the length of time that I have. Now, I wouldn't remember the details of every single one there, but I could look it up and then remember how to use it. Yeah, and of course, most of us probably use, 200-300 on a more regular daily basis.
Sure. Can you teach us about dandelion?
Yeah, for sure. Dandelion is a wonderful herb. It's my favorite diuretic. There are a lot of great diuretics, but dandelion just checks all the boxes, but right in the middle. It's not too extreme. It helps you pee, but you don't have to pee every 5 minutes. It's easily available. People aren't scared of it. It's inexpensive, and so many ways you can use it. So dandelion leaf, which is the diuretic part, you could eat as a food. And in fact, in the past and in many other places, people certainly do. It's a little bitter like other salad greens, and so you could steam it like spinach or eat it in a salad. You could juice it, all those ways to get the leaf in. And then the root is mainly a liver detoxifier. So that's going to be dried, ground to powder, and then you could take the powder in a pill or, whatever. So a typical dose of the leaf as a diuretic is going to be, 10 grams, somewhere in that neighborhood. I usually encourage people to make tea out of the dried chopped herb. That works pretty well, but it can be swallowed. And the root then usually is taken, of course, in powder form somehow as a pill or whatever. And typical dose there might be around 6-7 grams. Liver cleansers like dandelion, the typical side effect for that whole category is that they tend to produce queasiness and loose stool if you take too much. So that's a good indication with dandelion as you ramp up the dose gradually and you get to the place where you're starting to feel just a little bit queasy every day. That's a little bit too much, and you can back off a little bit. So speaking of that, let me just mention that incremental dose increase is really the way to go. And I don't know how many people get taught that, but clients certainly have no experience of that. Their medical doctor doesn't say, take chop your antibiotic pill in half, take a half a pill the first day, two halves the next day, and work up like that. But that reduces side effects drastically. Your body gets a chance to get used to those things a little bit, and then it doesn't sort of bark back. And then also it gives you a chance to stop it if you're having some kind of a problem before you hit the body with a full-blown dose. So pretty much everything I recommend with some kind of incremental dose increase, even if it's by the hour for a cold remedy. You can start with a small amount the first hour and a little bit more the second hour, work your way up. It's a big secret to having things really work well and figuring out proper doses.
You really are the dose guy, aren't you?
Yeah. Yep.
So you've been doing this for over 50 years. You've accomplished so much. I actually remember seeing your bio. I want to say it was like a 6-page PDF or something like that, and it just listed all these different things. And that wasn't like small potatoes. A lot of it was like president of the American Herbalist Guild and stuff like that. I'm just kind of curious what keeps you doing this, and where does the passion come from?
I just find it fascinating. The passion has never left. I started, learning about a few herbs here and there, and then got into it more and more. And the more I learn, the more I like it. And the fire has never dimmed for me for doing these kinds of things. I don't particularly like the bookkeeping or administrative side, or paying taxes and all that sort of thing. But the actual working with real people and helping them get better, and then teaching people who then can help other people get better, I just find fascinating. So I never get bored, with that part of it.
Yeah, the taxes and the accounting part is easily my least favorite part.
Right. There you go.
Do you have any advice for, say, herbal business owners?
Oh boy, that's a big subject, but we know that most of them fail, which is not encouraging, that's for sure. Yeah. And I counsel businesses on startups, or maybe they're going for a while and they want to be more profitable or something. So that's something that I do now as part of my occupation. But I find that most people have a fantasy of how they think it should be, and don't get to the nitty-gritty, properly, and they end up spending all of their savings on remodeling an old house to make a beautiful clinic, and then no one shows up, and they're out of business in a year, and then they're back to doing what they did before, but don't have their savings anymore. So just real serious, down-to-earth business kinds of issues. It's great to have dreams. You might want to open up an ice cream stand on the moon, but it's probably not going to be profitable. Yeah. So you have to make sure that you've figured it out and that you're nimble and you adjust as things need to change. So especially since the pandemic, things have just been stood on their head in every way, in every world. And so the world of online webinars and clientele. I don't have a brick and mortar facility anymore. It's all online, as are, I think, most of the practices of most people, as we got used to to that whole scenario. So you have to be able to make adjustments pretty quickly as you see things changing. And people's interests were just all over the place. This is a podcast. Who had even heard of a podcast 3 or 4 years ago?
Right.
And now everybody has a podcast. I don't have a podcast.
I was going to say, do you have one?
I don't. And it's not that I'm resistant to it,
Yeah.
but it's just hard to fit all these things in. So I would if I, maybe I get some extra time sometime. I'll do something.
I was recommending to someone the other day they should be on LinkedIn, and then I realized that's just another social media platform to be on and keep track of and constantly post on. So yeah, you really can't do it all. I will say you should have a podcast though, because I think you'd have a lot of listeners. But are you still seeing clients?
Yeah.
Whether you are okay,
Absolutely.
both virtually and in person.
Virtually only.
Oh, virtually only.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Was that since the pandemic, or
It was.
Was it kind of like that?
Yeah,
Okay.
that just stood everything on its head. I've never had a brick and mortar facility
Yeah.
in Eugene, but until the pandemic, I traveled extensively and I was out of town every weekend somewhere in North America, teaching. And often I would have clients in association with that. So, I teach on Saturday and have a client day on Sunday or something like that. So those were in person for many, many years. And then when you couldn't do that anymore, and now I've just filled up with the remote way of doing it, so that's what I'm doing.
Nice. So sticking with the advice theme, do you have any advice for, say, herbal practitioners who are trying to run an herbal clinic? Another big topic.
Yeah, I guess I kind of go back to the level-headed nature of the whole thing and distinguish between your fantasy about what could be or what should be, and think about what is and what's really working. One of the things that's a real controversy in natural medicine is whether or not it's righteous to treat symptoms. So especially Chinese medicine and Ayurveda are not very oriented to symptom treatment. It's a long-term, slow kind of situation. Western herbalists are a little bit more oriented towards symptoms, but still there's general grumbling about that we don't want to treat symptoms because it's just not getting us anywhere. A person has a headache every day, you have them drink a cup of willow bark tea every day, that knocks out their headache, but it doesn't solve the underlying thing that caused it. So I would encourage people to just consider whether or not treating symptoms is something that you want to do, you feel good about it, but it's really the secret for a lot of people to be able to just sustain their practice. People come in with migraines or whatever the thing is, and they'll give you a little time to start creating some result, but if they're not getting some result pretty quickly, they move on, and eventually they find someone who will treat their symptoms. Migraine is a great example of something that in a day we can get going with some things that will completely suppress it. And imagine what that would do to your life to just no longer have migraines. And then we can go back and simultaneously work on the underlying kinds of issues. So being a little bit more willing to treat symptoms and not being so dogmatic about that everything has to be holistic because you read that in some old dusty textbook. We understand that that's the basis of where we want to go with people. But often it takes people many tries at herbal medicine to really get it and figure out what to do. I always tell students it's best that you're the 10th herbalist that someone consulted instead of the first.
Yeah.
Because the first might be the best herbalist in the world, but they're still getting their feet wet. Nasty tasting teas, funny names, where do I get that stuff? It's not working fast enough, all of that. And by the 10th, if you're the 10th, they've worked through all that and they realize there's some benefit and they've answered some of their own questions and figure out how to decoct an herb and all of that. So yeah, that would be really core advice, I think, is being willing to treat symptoms. And then we just have to be open to what people think they want to do for the long run. All of us want to help people get well and maintain that optimal health, the rest of their life. Just not in our culture to even understand that that's possible or what that is. So it takes a lot of education.
Are your clients like new clients, or are they a lot of them like long-time clients, or a mixture of the two?
It's definitely a bell curve. So, I would say that half of them, in any given month might be people that are relatively new, first or second session, and then the other half, I have clients going back 40, 45 years that I'm still seeing. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. With the new clients, do you ever notice that they're kind of surprised at how well this herbal stuff works?
Constantly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you have any stories surrounding that, or is it just...
how well it works? Well, I treat a lot of MS, and I'm one of the people in North American herbalists that probably treats the most. We have another colleague on the East Coast that also treats a lot. And when he and I met each other, we discovered that our protocols were virtually identical because, again, what works, right? So you find people that are doing similar things. It's very true. This book with Michael Tierra, when we put our heads together, we were doing, the same things in the same way. So the things that work, you find out about. That's an example of a condition that people just have no idea could be treated. They've been told by their neurologist that it's ultimately always going to get worse. It's only a question not of if, but when, and what the pattern is going to be. And that's something that we've been working on for, a good 30 years, and we've nailed it now. I mean, we know how to treat MS. There's not a lot of people that come to us with that, but people who are interested in that often get great results. I have dozens of clients who were in a wheelchair and are now walking around and have no symptoms of MS. So it's really progressed tremendously in this last 50 years, as people experimented clinically and we learned things from other people in other countries, and we could blend all these ideas. Some things that even a few years ago we would have thought would be very difficult to treat, but now we're really getting a good handle on it. Yeah. So often clients don't really know what's appropriate to treat. Sometimes they have, of course, greater expectations. There are some things like Alzheimer's we haven't made much progress with. I've treated virtually no Alzheimer's because the people who would have had Alzheimer's by now are a generation older than me. They weren't interested in herbal medicine. But people my age, the baby boomers, are now starting to, develop that. And so they're very interested, and they're petrified that they're going to get Alzheimer's. Everybody knows someone who's had it, died of it. So they often are very surprised that there are things that we can do. Although, again, we're still in the learning phase with that. Many people in alternative medicine feel like we'll crack the code within the next, let's say, 10 years with dementia. We've made a lot of nice progress. Conventional medicine has made a lot of nice progress, and they're coming together. And so I think that it's going to be like MS was for us, 20 years ago.
Do you have any theories right now on how you could help with Alzheimer's herbally that you're willing to share?
We now know that most of the damage starts from inflammation. And in fact, pretty much every chronic degenerative disease we now know starts with chronic subclinical inflammation. Not enough that you would even notice that there's inflammation, but it's like slow cooking, and people are just cooking themselves to death. It's like if you left a pilot light on in your oven for 50 years, it would gradually destroy your oven, but you couldn't see the changes from day to day. So people's bodies are being damaged, and it happens if it's in the brain, then that is a major factor. So we've seen a lot of brain diseases like depression also respond to anti-inflammatory kinds of things. A lot of that research is in the animal stage now, and we're still working out all those details of the dose and when and how to use it and all that. But anti-inflammatory kinds of things, and then there are a bunch of just general brain herbs that somehow seem to work really well. My favorite, this is my area of specialty, is neurology, and so I largely deal with things like migraine, epilepsy, neuralgia, MS. So I'm particularly interested in these kinds of things, and my favorite herb in that entire field is the herb gotu-kola, which comes from South Asia and East Asia, and that is just a very general, broad-spectrum brain remedy that benefits just about any kind of neurological situation, and really just one of my favorite herbs. It works well, although it's kind of slow and the dose is kind of high because it's mild.
I'm presuming you take that?
I don't take gotu-kola.
Oh, you don't?
But I take some various other brain herbs. My wife takes gotu-kola. Okay. It's something that's definitely in my orbit. I have a metabolism that's a bit more on the cool side, and gotu-kola is a cooling herb. So I do better if I don't include a lot of cooling herbs in my program. So there are some other, ashwagandha is a noted brain herb, for example, that's not cooling. So
what about Brahmi?
That's gotu-kola.
Brahmi is gotu-kola. I'm thinking of Bacopa.
Right. There are two herbs in that same milieu that have the same name in Sanskrit. Brahmi means godlike. In other words, to have a mind like God. Oh. And so because in the classic texts, they didn't have, Latin names, and they just called it all Brahmi, and we didn't know which herb they were talking about. So today, it's thought that it could be Bacopa or it could be gotu-kola. So Bacopa is about twice the potency of gotu-kola, so the dose is only half. That's good. It's colder and drier than gotu-kola, but it does similar things.
Yeah, I want to say I remember taking the tincture of Bacopa at Mountain Rose when I worked there, and I almost want to say it had like a tobacco-like flavor.
Really?
Yeah, that's how my taste buds interpreted it, at least. But yeah, I liked that one. Do you have any thoughts on ginkgo biloba?
Oh, fantastic remedy. I use it extensively. Now, there's an example of something that came out of modern science. There's this kind of myth that ginkgo was an ancient Chinese remedy, but in fact, not really. It was known and maybe used minimally, but the ginkgo nut was a little bit more likely to be used, and that treats asthma primarily. But if we go back a few decades, I don't know, it might have been 30 years, a bunch of Italian phytochemists were looking for some plants that had some particular flavonoids to act as, again, anti-inflammatories. And so they were checking plants from all over the world. And there's probably a ginkgo tree growing outside their office. I don't know how they got the idea to check ginkgo, but they did. And voila, that was the one that they wanted. And so they made a concentrate in the lab. And it was a 50-to-1 concentrate. That is, 50 pounds of dried gotu kola leaf makes 1 pound of the medicine, so very concentrated. And they began studying it, and it worked just very, very well. And we've just used it in that same way ever since. Everybody wants to use the thing that was used in the way it was used in the original study, and then everybody just keeps replicating that. So now 30 years later, that's fantastic for circulation throughout the body in general without being heating. So most of the herbs that we use that promote circulation are just warming vasodilators, ginger, cinnamon, clove, that kind of stuff. And so sometimes that's too hot for people. So ginkgo is not heating, it's just kind of neutral in temperature. And then it also has some great benefits for just rebuilding the ground substance, the glue that holds together all of our cells, especially in the nervous system. And boy, it does a lot of great things, that's for sure.
Two things. I just realized on these podcast episodes, I want to start asking about the plants more, because it's a lot of fun. You'll be surprised, like a lot of times I just kind of get the people's story, but this is great. I love riffing on the plants. And it just occurred to me, I've been wanting to ask you this for a while, and I didn't even write this down on my question list, but I remember years ago I read a blog post by Jim McDonald on calamus, and he specifically referenced, I want to say it was a video class that you had online somewhere.
Oh, really?
And he, I want to say he told some story about how you helped this child use calamus, and then he started, I don't want to give away the punchline, but something about his parents. So you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Do you mind telling that story? Because Jim McDonald's very infatuated with the plant calamus, and
good for him.
You know, I really enjoy it now because of him, and I'm getting goosebumps. I love that story. So if you want to share with us.
Oh yeah, it's a really emotional story. There are actually several cases of this. So because I work in the area of neurology, I'm involved with all kinds of neurological issues, and I've been working with autism for 30 years. So this boy had autism, and he was nonverbal. He could make some sounds, and he could make his needs known by gestures and things like that. So he was 16. I was treating him, and we'd been working for about 6 months or so, kind of laying some groundwork and working on some of the things that autism is about. And then it was time to use the calamus. So I had him take a dose, and then his parents were telling me that this incident happened about 3 or 4 days after he started taking the calamus. So he liked to watch TV with his nose right up against the TV, and he was watching his favorite TV show, which was SpongeBob SquarePants. And his parents were sitting together on the couch a ways back in the living room, just relaxing and enjoying it. And a commercial came on, and he turned around and looked right into the eyes of his parents and said, "Mom and Dad, I love you." That was the first sentence he'd ever said. It was a full sentence. He made perfect eye contact and expressed, his personal feeling. And within, by a week after that, he came into, I was treating him. I had an office in that situation, and he came into the office, and he just would not shut up. I mean, you can imagine having all that bottled up in you for 16 years.
Sure.
And amazing how his brain knew how to tell his mouth how to say those things, with no practice. But he just was a font of talking, which of course just was great. Everybody just thought it was fantastic, and he progressed quickly, after that.
Were you the one that said it connects the heart to the mouth?
Yeah, well, usually we say the mind to the mouth, but that's exactly it.
Gotcha.
Yeah. One of my colleagues, an Indian doctor, the other day said, that stuff, that would make a donkey talk. And that's really, the name in Sanskrit for calamus is vacha, which means speech. And so it's very much associated with the brain connecting with the ability to communicate. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually started chewing on the root specifically. A, I know Jim McDonald likes to chew on the root, and B, for that specific reason, I was really struggling with, like, say, public speaking and stuff like that. So maybe I'll credit Calamus for getting the Herbalist Hour going. So,
well, two more things to tell you about
please,
Calamus.
yeah.
So I teach at naturopathic medical schools, and I teach herb programs to naturopathic or future naturopathic doctors. And, you know, in that program, it's very intense, and they have, you know, hours and hours a week of homework, and they're staying up till 1 or 2 in the morning cramming for tests. And they would complain to me, oh, you know, that last page I'm trying to study, I'll read it, and then I can't remember anything that I've read, and I'll read it again and still can't remember it. And so I suggest using Calamus. And then they come back in, you know, a week or 2 later and say, oh my God, I can remember everything that I read. I don't have to study nearly as long, you know, at night. And then they tell their friends who tell their friends, and by the end of the year, the entire school is, you know, taking the Calamus. So it's well known in the naturopathic world from my suggesting it to students for their, you know, for their memory. So it enhances our ability to just to process thought and make it into memory, and then to extract memories, you know, when you need them. The other thing to know about Calamus, though, is that it's very nauseating. Did I say it was nauseating? Yes. You really have to be very aware of this, because people kind of think, you know, he's just being conservative. But really, if each of us sitting here took, let's say, 4 grams of Calamus on an empty stomach, we'd be puking all over the place. So I would recommend divided doses with food generally, and I usually start with about a 1/4 gram, 250 milligrams, and increase in 1/4 gram increments. So, you know, every couple of days you bump it up a little bit. So by the end of, you know, a couple of weeks, you're taking maybe about 4 grams. That's a pretty typical dose. Most people can't push much beyond that. Now, if you use it in tincture form, which is very common in Western herbalism, it then, of course, goes right into your mouth, into your bloodstream, and that's more likely to make you nauseated because the constituents are just, you know, ready to go.
So there's the nausea, but then there's other safety concerns as well. So I feel like I would have to do my due diligence to bring up the safety concerns around Calamus. I don't remember the exact study that Jim McDonald talks about, but he was basically talking about extracting one constituent in Calamus and then giving high doses to rats, and then that was fatal, essentially, which obviously isn't going to be comparable to a large human chewing on a little bit of the root. Right, so exactly. Do you have any safety concerns, say, besides the nausea?
Well, the constituent you're talking about is beta-acerone, and we know that that is a precancerous chemical, and so we don't want people consuming a lot of that. The question is, what dose would be tolerable? How would it work? Does it cause this problem in people? And yeah, you're right. The studies that looked at that were a long time ago, and were exactly what you said, injecting it into the rat, and the rats got cancer. So in the law in the United States, or FDA regulations, if any substance causes cancer in any other living thing, it can't be used for human consumption. So Calamus can't be used. It used to be an ingredient in some alcoholic beverages, for example. FDA disallowed that, can't be used as food. It's still allowed to be sold as a dietary supplement, but the issue with Calamus is that it's a very strange plant that reproduces in a very weird way. And so the constituents are quite different in different places that it grows. So Europe, India, China, it's used in all those systems. And any given subspecies might have more of that beta-acerone than others. We don't really know if that carcinogenic chemical is actually also the active ingredient. We just don't know that. But that's the concern. So I'm less inclined to use Calamus with the general public because, of course, now they Googleize everything and they're going to know about that instantly and then have concerns about that. But for people who feel like they're okay with it, it's just fantastic herb for all the reasons we just talked about.
So when you say you like an herb, a lot of times are you referring to like you like to use it, say, on clients, or are you like with Calamus, do you consume it sometimes? Or
well, I don't really have a need to to use it, although I wouldn't have any objection to it. Calamus is usually used short term. So you take it for maybe, 3 to 6 months, something like that. So I wouldn't take it as a maintenance herb anyway. But no, I do not take it. But when I say I like an herb, I mean therapeutically for people. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So you've been at this, like we mentioned a couple times, for over 50 years. You'd be a good person to ask this. This actually is a pretty common question in the HerbRally community. When do you get to call yourself an herbalist?
Yeah, there is no particular place, and that's unfortunate in a way because considering that there are no standards, I got a newsletter the other day from someone who was her first newsletter, and she had just graduated from herb school and established her own school. Well, she'd gone to herb school for 1 year, and now she was the teacher of teachers, and the newsletter was something like, I'm finally there. I've opened up my own school, and this is my first newsletter. I'm sure she learned something in herb school, but she certainly wasn't very seasoned. Was she really in a position to teach people what she had just barely learned? Sure. So everything is so new in our culture that we have this problem now of rapidly rotating teachers. Mm-hmm. People graduate from, whether it's naturopathic school or whatever, and they're a professor, the next year, and they don't have any, any seasoning. So it's going to work its way out eventually. It's just because it's so new.
Yeah, I always bring this up. Paul Bergner has a class. Every decade he changes the name, but it's how to be a master herbalist in 50 years. Yeah, right. It's like kind of tongue-in-cheek. And then we asked Howie Brownstein the same question, and he's like, I think after 40 years, I could finally call myself an herbalist. So.
Yeah, it's really true. All of us have the feeling that we're drinking from a fire hose, and it wasn't like that in the beginning, but it's been like that for many years now. And some colleague will say, "Oh, I saw so and so speak at a conference, and I think I'm going to go be a grocery checker at Safeway because I'm not, anywhere close to that level of that person." But then everybody else says that same thing about her. Sure. Right. It's just way too much. You can't absorb even a tiny fraction of everything there is to know. So you get good at it. I don't know if it's a matter of time or just experience, but there is no cut point where you get an official stamp of approval. We do have these credentials, like the American Herbalist Guild. I was on the admissions committee for a while. I'm no longer there, but reviewing applications of people who want that credential. And that credential is a beginning level of competence. It's like a medical doctor getting their doctorate, but they have not yet been an intern or a resident. Right. And they don't have 10 years of doing the same surgery or whatever it is. So that would be a minimum, and there's some other credentials around that would give, not necessarily in herbalism, but in allied fields that would at least give a sense that you've been evaluated. I have a doctorate in Ayurveda, for example, and so there were minimum competency requirements and minimum, practice requirements for that. So there are some things around, and those add to the credibility for people.
So you're Dr. Khalsa?
Well, if you use that. Yeah.
I guess if I did take your class in 2008, that's 15 years ago. I still struggle with saying I'm an herbalist. Then again, I'm not a clinical herbalist, and I don't rigorously study all the time either. I've taken 2 herbal apprenticeships at the Arctos School in Portland, and then with Howie and at the Columbine School. But I still kind of struggle with that title. It's all good. I run a herbalism website and podcast, but like you said, it's the fire hose. It's just so fun to just keep learning and growing and talking plants with people. So. Is there anything else that you want to maybe promote or get across to the HerbRally audience?
Well, if people are interested, they could just go to my website, which is International Integrative, with a VE on the end, integrative, all one word.com. But you could just use my name and Google it. It'll take you right there. And it's packed with a whole lot of educational information, a bunch of videos, bunch of blogs and things. And then you'll see we have 300 pre-recorded courses there available. So I've done a course in just about every topic you could imagine in natural medicine, and they're anywhere from a 90-minute superficial webinar to some very deep, long courses. So those are available, and our courses are live usually, the professional courses, and so some of those are on every evening for a year, 2 years, something like that. Anyway, you can go check those things out. So we have a lot of things going. We'd love to have you there.
Yeah, I can't recommend KP's work enough. You always blow me away with how much you know, and I love how you teach. And as you're a testament, you've taught thousands of people, I'm sure, including Rosalee. She speaks very highly of you as well. So definitely check out KP's work. We'll leave all the links to that in the YouTube description and the podcast show notes and everything. So thanks so much for your time, KP.
Oh yeah, it's my pleasure. Nice to see you.
That was a good time. All right, see you later. And that's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening to the HerbRally podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us here at HerbRally, we now have a text message community, believe it or not. Basically, it's just updates from us. We send about 1 to 7 texts per week, notifying you about new events, videos, courses, podcasts. You get the idea. It's pretty much like our email newsletter, just in text form. So if you'd like to receive text messages from HerbRally, just text JOIN, that's JOIN, to the number 541-256-2895. Again, that's join to number 541-256-2895. And to stop receiving texts, that's easy too. Just text STOP to the same number. It'll opt you out immediately. Okay, thanks again for listening. Have a great rest of your day.